So I want you to picture a young man standing right in the middle of a freezing, snow-covered public square. This is in 13th century Italy.
Oh, setting the scene. I like it.
Right. So he's the son of this incredibly wealthy cloth merchant. But today, he is surrounded by staring townsfolk, a furious father, and a very baffled bishop. And this young man isn't wearing fine silk.
He's not wearing anything at all, actually.
Exactly. He has just stripped completely naked. He hands every single piece of his clothing to his father and publicly renounces all his wealth, his entire inheritance, any connection to worldly power.
Just a total rejection of everything his society valued.
Yeah. He walks out into the freezing winter, fully embracing a life of absolute brutal poverty. History ends up calling him a holy fool. His given name was Giovanni, but you probably know him as St. Francis of Assisi.
It really is one of the most radical renunciations of wealth and power in recorded history. I mean, it's extreme.
It is. And it becomes this staggering historical paradox when you realize what happens next.
Right, because fast forward 4 centuries, and you have this global empire, an empire completely driven by the conquest of land, the extraction of wealth, the subjugation of indigenous peoples.
Yeah, the exact opposite of what St. Francis stood for.
Exactly. And this empire marches into a remote, high-altitude desert and decides to name their brand new imperial capital in honor of that very same naked, impoverished saint.
Okay, let's unpack this, because usually, when you talk about history, you expect precision. You expect a pristine timeline where a historian points at a date and says, there, that's when it started.
Right, a nice, neat starting line.
But when you step into the world of Santa Fe, New Mexico, that linear timeline just completely shatters.
It really does. It falls apart.
Think of Santa Fe's history like an ancient adobe wall. Every generation slaps on a new layer of mud, basically trying to completely cover up whatever was there before.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you look closely, the mud cracks. And those cracks reveal centuries of hidden competing stories.
And for this deep dive, you are looking at a really incredible stack of sources. We have everything from official National Park Service records and colonial Spanish journals to modern archaeological research on indigenous resistance.
Yeah, we even have dramaturg notes from a local playhouse, which is super interesting.
And deeply personal community histories, too. It's a very rich set of materials.
So our mission today is to break down the timeline of the oldest capital city in North America. But we aren't just going to rattle off dates.
No, nobody wants that.
Right. We're looking at a living, breathing landscape sitting 7,200 feet up at the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo, the Blood of Christ Mountains.
And it is a story of overlapping civilizations, massive rebellions, and just absolute relentless reinvention.
So where do we even begin?
Well, to even begin to understand this place, you have to completely abandon the traditional Eurocentric timeline.
Just throw it out.
Pretty much. Because if you look for a starting line that involves a Spanish flag planted in the dirt, you completely miss the foundation of the city. We have to rewind centuries before the word Spain ever echoed in that high desert. I mean, the archaeological record shows that thousands of years before the famous settlements, you had archaic hunter-gatherers and Paleo-Indian nomadic hunters making seasonal camps there.
Wow, really?
Yeah, we have fossil points dating back to 9500 BCE.
Okay, so that completely undercuts this bizarre claim you sometimes see on tourism websites today.
Oh, the founding myth.
Yeah. You'll read a brochure crediting Santa Fe's nickname, the city different, to some frontiersman at the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
How can anyone credit the founding identity of a city to a 1900s cowboy when indigenous people were engineering irrigation and building actual cities there 1,000 years prior?
It's wild, right? But that is the first layer of mud on the wall. It's a very deliberate historical erasure.
Designed to package a neat, marketable origin story for tourists.
Exactly. But the direct predecessors to the modern city were the Tawa people. Around 900 AD, they founded a village along the Santa Fe River.
And the river was fundamentally different back then, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. It was a robust, navigable waterway, not the little trickle you often see today.
Right.
The Tiwa called this village Ogapuji, which means white shell water place. And the Navajos called it Uto, or string of water beads.
String of water beads. I love that.
Yeah, it visually captures how the standing pools of water looked, just shimmering in the sun.
You can really hear in those names just how vital water was. I mean, at 7,200 feet, water is everything.
Absolutely everything.
And by the 1200s, during what archaeologists call the Pueblo III era, this wasn't just some temporary survival camp. You had complex ancestral Pueblo societies absolutely thriving.
We are talking about brilliant urban planners and engineers here.
Yeah, they were building multi-story adobe and stone villages. They mastered the agricultural triad of corn, beans, and squash.
Which is incredibly hard to do at that altitude.
Right, and they engineered these incredibly intricate irrigation channels to catch the snow melt from the mountains.
And you have to understand, the mechanics of their society were rooted in a worldview that was entirely alien to the Europeans who would later arrive.
How so?
Well, time was not viewed as a straight arrow marching toward economic progress, the way Europeans saw it. Time was circular.
Circular.
Yeah, it was locked into the seasons, celestial movements, and agricultural cycles.
That makes a lot of sense for a farming society.
And that circularity extended to their governance, too. Leadership was not an autocratic system with a king and a standing army.
No monarchs.
Right. It was communal, it was religious, and it rotated among different leaders depending on the season.
And the relationship to the physical dirt beneath their feet wasn't about real estate or property lines.
Yeah,
Right?
the concept of owning the landscape would have been completely absurd to them.
Like trying to own the air?
Exactly. The landscape was a living, sacred entity. They built kivas, which were these deep, underground ceremonial chambers.
And these weren't just like community meeting rooms.
No, they were literal and spiritual tethers to the earth. Every kiva contained a sipapu.
What's a sipapu?
It's a small hole in the floor that symbolized the spiritual portal through which the Tiwa believed humanity originally emerged into this world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they didn't own the land, they emerged from it. It's a profound difference.
And to make this real for you listening, the footprint of this massive civilization isn't gone. It is literally buried under the modern city streets.
It is everywhere.
Archaeologists have found the remains of ancient settlements, places like Arroyo Negro and Pueblo. There was a thriving settlement right where the modern Santa Fe High School stands today.
Yeah, and beneath the modern Civic Center, they unearthed pit houses built over a millennium ago.
That is just incredible to think about when you're walking around downtown.
Now, severe generational droughts did eventually force many of these inhabitants to migrate to other pueblos, but the cultural footprint remained.
The land didn't stop being sacred.
Right. It was still actively used and still deeply understood by the surrounding Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, Tano, and Keres people, as well as the Dene, Jicarilla, Apache, Zuni, and Hopi.
Okay, so you have this ancient, balanced, cyclical world. But in the mid-16th century, that circular timeline is violently interrupted.
Very violently.
Whispers start coming up from the south about men wearing metal.
Yeah, and the first major shockwave hits in 1540. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado leads a massive expedition up from Mexico.
And he is basically driven by a phantom.
Completely. He is lured by the myth of the seven cities of gold, or Cibola.
Right.
He marches thousands of miles with over 300 Spanish soldiers, hundreds of indigenous allies, livestock, priests, the whole 9 yards.
I just can't imagine the psychological whiplash of that moment.
For Coronado.
Yeah. You march through brutal deserts expecting to find a golden empire you can loot so you can become a lord back in Spain. And instead you find stone and adobe pueblos shimmering in the heat. There's no gold.
None. Just corn, beans, and profound disappointment.
And that disappointment immediately curdled into rage.
It really did. The Pueblo peoples understandably viewed Coronado's army as violent, unpredictable scavengers. I mean, these guys showed up and just demanded their winter food supply.
Which is a death sentence in the winter.
Exactly.
Right.
So when the Pueblos resisted, Coronado responded with horrific violence. During what's known as the Tiwa Massacre, his forces burned hundreds of people alive in their villages.
It's just sickening.
It is. After securing no wealth, the expedition eventually turned back. But the traumatic memory of their armor and their cruelty stayed. It was seared into the region.
So it takes a few decades, but the Spanish Empire finally realizes there's no gold in the north.
Right.
So their motivation shifts. If they can't harvest silver, the Catholic Church, specifically the Franciscan friars, lobbies the crown to let them go north to harvest souls.
Which brings Juan de Oñate into the picture in 1598.
Oñate.
Yeah. He was a wealthy, powerful Basque landowner, and his mandate from the crown was to colonize, convert, and settle.
He brings what, like 500 colonists?
About 500, yeah. And he establishes a capital near the Tuwa village of Oke-Oingya. But Oñate rules like an absolute tyrant. He demands impossible amounts of food, forced labor, and total obedience.
And when you read the primary sources regarding how he dealt with resistance, it is genuinely hard to stomach.
The brutality was extreme.
In 1598, the people of Acoma Pueblo refused to hand over their vital winter food supplies to the Spanish. A skirmish broke out, and Oñate's nephew was killed.
Right.
Oñate's retaliation wasn't just a battle, it was an annihilation. He ordered the Acoma Pueblo, which sits on top of this massive sheer mesa, to be destroyed.
A very hard place to attack, too.
Yeah, but they massacred an estimated 800 to 1,000 Acoma men, women, and children.
And the judicial punishment for the survivors is really what cements Oñate's dark legacy.
They're horrifying.
He decreed that all surviving Acoma men of fighting age were to have the ends of their right feet amputated.
Just wow.
Yeah. And then the remaining 500 tribe members were sentenced to 20 years of forced servitude, which is essentially slavery.
That level of barbarity was so extreme that even the Spanish court back in Mexico City and Madrid, and keep in mind, an empire not exactly known for its gentle touch, they were actually horrified.
They were. They actually recalled Oñate in 1607 and tried him for excessive cruelty.
But the recall of Oñate didn't mean they were abandoning the colony.
No, not at all. The Spanish crown appointed a new governor, Pedro de Peralta, with strict orders to find a more defensible, strategic location for a permanent capital.
So Peralta surveys the Santa Fe River Valley.
Right. It was geographically protected, it had reliable water, and it sat squarely among the existing Pueblo villages, which made it much easier to extract labor. So in 1610, he officially moves the capital there.
And he gives it a name that perfectly distills the absolute hypocrisy of the Spanish colonial project.
Oh, the name is something else.
La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís, the royal city of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi.
We talked about St. Francis at the very beginning of this deep dive. The man who stripped naked to escape wealth and worldly power.
The contrast is just nauseating.
It really is. The royal city represents the crushing weight of the monarchy and the sword, while the Holy Faith represents the church and the cross.
They named a city after the ultimate pacifist and then built it using the forced labor of the indigenous people they were actively subjugating.
And let's talk about that physical construction, actually, because Peralta didn't just pitch tents. He laid out a classic European grid.
Right, with a central plaza radiating outward.
Exactly. They built an arsenal, a chapel, and the Casas Reales, which included the palace of the governors.
And if you visit Santa Fe today, that exact palace is still standing on the plaza. It is the oldest, continuously occupied public building in the United States.
But the mechanics of building it are crucial here. The Spanish wanted a European layout, but they were stranded thousands of miles away from European stonemasons.
They had no materials.
So they had to rely on indigenous techniques. They used adobe mud, massively thick earthen walls, and heavy wooden vigas to support flat roofs.
So it was European spatial design,
Yeah.
but manifested entirely through indigenous materials and forced indigenous sweat.
Exactly. And the sources highlight a really intense historical debate around one specific building from this era, the San Miguel Mission.
Oh, yeah. Local tourism heavily promotes it as the oldest church in the United States. They claim it was built in 1605.
But historians are constantly fighting over this date.
Why?
Well, the debate hinges on the timeline. Was the church built by early Spanish settlers and their indigenous servants in 1605 or 1607 before Peralta officially founded the city?
Okay.
Or was it built after 1610 as part of his master plan?
But the sources suggest that beyond the exact date, the truly vital history of the San Miguel Mission is the neighborhood it was built in.
Yes, Barrio de Analco.
The history of Barrio de Analco is incredibly painful. Analco is a Nahuatl word from Mexico, meaning across the water, because the neighborhood sat across the river from the plaza.
Right, and the Spanish deliberately segregated their indigenous servants there.
Initially, these were Tlaxcalan people they had brought all the way up from Mexico, right?
Right, but over time, the barrio really became the center for the Genízaros.
We really have to define Genízaros because it is a devastating mechanism of colonial control.
It is heartbreaking.
Genízaros were Native American children, Comanche, Apache, Ute, Navajo, who were violently kidnapped by rival tribes or Spanish soldiers and then sold into slavery to serve in Spanish households in Santa Fe.
They were baptized against their will, stripped of their native languages, and forced to assimilate.
They became a massive, marginalized underclass.
They really did.
Okay, wait. Stuck on something here. Here's where it gets really interesting. I understand the church wanting to harvest souls, but looking at this from the perspective of the Spanish crown, why go to all this trouble?
What do you mean?
Why maintain a capital in a remote, freezing high desert that is a brutal 1,500-mile walk from Mexico City, requires a massive military presence, and produces absolutely zero gold or silver. Why not just abandon it?
That is the perfect question. And the answer is that Santa Fe was basically a massive geopolitical bluff.
A bluff.
Yeah. Spain was looking at the global map with mounting anxiety. They saw English ships probing the Atlantic coast. They knew French trappers were edging down from the Mississippi basin.
Ah, so they were feeling surrounded.
Very much so.
Yeah.
They needed a physical shield to protect the silver mines deep in Mexico. So by planting a capital in Santa Fe, even a starving, unprofitable one, Spain was throwing a flag down.
So it was just a buffer zone.
A heavily militarized buffer zone combined with a religious utopia for the Franciscans. Because there was no gold, the crown essentially handed daily control of the indigenous population over to the friars to run as a massive spiritual experiment.
Which brings us to a boiling point. For decades, from 1610 to 1680, the Franciscan friars enacted a systemic, brutal campaign to completely erase the Pueblo identity.
They didn't just preach, they criminalized indigenous existence.
They banned the Catina dances, which were the absolute center of Pueblo spirituality. They raided the kivas and smashed sacred objects.
And they altered the physical landscape of worship, too. The deep kivas were traditionally accessed by wooden ladders.
Right.
The friars removed the ladders and replaced them with heavy wooden crosses.
Wow.
So they were forcing the Pueblo people to physically climb over the symbol of their subjugation just to enter their own sacred spaces.
That's incredibly psychological.
And they mandated mass attendance and instituted what they called residential education.
Our dramaturg sources point out that residential education is just a sanitized, bureaucratic term for kidnapping children from their parents to indoctrinate them and break the cultural chain.
Precisely. And if an adult was caught performing a traditional rain ceremony, the punishment was severe. Public whipping, branding with hot irons, or imprisonment.
But the Pueblo people did not just passively accept this erasure, they engineered brilliant methods of survival.
Historians call it Pueblo Catholicism.
How does that work?
Well, on the surface, to avoid the whip, they attended Mass, but they compartmentalized. They hid their ceremonial masks literally behind the Catholic altars.
That is so bold.
Right. And at night, they retreated into the canyons or deep into the kivas to speak to their ancestors.
But the tension was unsustainable. The paranoia of the Spanish governor eventually snaps in 1675.
Yeah, things come to a head.
He arrests 47 Pueblo spiritual leaders, accusing them of sorcery and treason. He sentences 4 of them to death by hanging. The rest are dragged into the Santa Fe Plaza, tied to posts, publicly whipped, and thrown in a dungeon.
And among those bleeding from the lash is a Tiwa religious leader from Oke Oenga. His name is Pope.
The Spanish eventually released Pope, assuming the whipping broke him.
It was a fatal miscalculation on their part.
Yeah, because the whip didn't break Pope, it radicalized him.
He realized that the Pueblo villages, which historically had their own rivalries and spoke entirely different languages, were being picked off one by one.
So they had to unite.
Exactly. The only mechanism for survival was total, unprecedented unity. He retreated to Taos Pueblo and spent 5 years secretly traveling, weaving a massive covert alliance.
And this culminates on August 10th, 1680, the Pueblo Revolt.
Under Pope's leadership, Pueblo warriors launched a coordinated, massive uprising across hundreds of miles of desert.
It wasn't just a riot, it was a highly organized military strike.
Absolutely. They burned the mission churches to the ground, including the San Miguel mission we talked about earlier. They executed 21 priests. They killed over 400 Spanish colonists.
To this day, the Pueblo Revolt remains the most successful indigenous uprising against European colonization in the history of North America.
It is unparalleled.
I am just endlessly fascinated by the logistics of this. Put yourself in Pope's shoes for a second. You have dozens of autonomous villages.
Right.
They speak different dialects. They are separated by hundreds of miles of brutal terrain. You have no horses, no written language, and you are operating under the nose of paranoid Spanish soldiers. How do you synchronize a simultaneous attack?
It is a masterpiece of decentralized communication. Pope and his inner circle utilized runners.
Runners?
Yeah. These runners carried cords made of braided yucca fibers. Tied into these cords were a specific number of knots. Each knot represented one day. The runners would slip into a pueblo at night, meet with the leaders, and hand them the cord. Every morning, the leader would untie one knot.
Oh, wow.
When the final knot was untied, that was the exact day to strike. It was essentially an encrypted physical countdown clock that synchronized an entire region without a single written word.
That is just brilliant.
Yeah.
So the final knot is untied, the strike happens, the surviving Spanish, about 1,000 colonists, soldiers, and all their livestock flee in terror to Santa Fe.
Right, they retreat to the capital.
They barricade themselves inside the Casas Reales, right inside the palace of the governors. The Pueblo warriors descend on the capital and completely surround it. And they don't just attack the walls. They understand siege warfare.
They do. They divert the water supply that flows into the Spanish barricade.
After days of baking in the August heat with no water, surrounded by the rotting carcasses of their own livestock, the Spanish governor realizes they're all going to die. He negotiates a retreat.
The Pueblo warriors allow the Spanish to break out, but they force them to walk away.
The Spanish are forced to march 400 miles south, through the lethal Jornada del Muerto desert, all the way down to El Paso del Norte.
And just like that, the Spanish Empire is expelled.
For 12 years, the region belongs to the Pueblo people again. Pope orders a massive cultural cleansing. They scrub off their Catholic baptisms with yucca root. They drop their Spanish names. They rebuild the kivas. The cyclical timeline resumes.
But the Spanish crown sitting in Madrid did not view this as a permanent defeat.
Of course not.
The political humiliation of losing their northernmost shield to an indigenous alliance was unacceptable. They had to return. Which brings us to the next massive, violently contested layer of mud on the timeline.
The period from 1692 to 1704.
Exactly. And the enduring myth of the bloodless reconquest.
In 1692, the crown appoints Diego de Vargas as the new governor of New Mexico, with explicit orders to take it back. And the sources provide incredible detail on de Vargas the man, not just the monument.
Yeah, he wasn't just a stoic conquistador on a horse. He was Spanish nobility, born in Madrid, but his life was defined by compounding tragedy and crippling debt.
De Vargas's personal life is basically a tragic soap opera.
It really is. He left his first wife, Doña Beatriz, and their 5 young children in Spain to take political jobs in the Americas just to pay off massive family debts.
And Beatriz died unexpectedly while he was gone.
Right. He ended up starting a second informal family in Mexico with a woman named Nicolasa Rincon. By the time he applies for the governorship of New Mexico, he is desperate.
He needs a massive military victory to secure his financial legacy and prove his worth to the crown.
So in August 1692, de Vargas marches north from El Paso with 200 heavily armed soldiers and indigenous allies. In mid-September, he arrives at the Santa Fe Plaza.
He finds the city fortified and occupied by roughly 1,000 Pueblo people. And this exact moment is the birthplace of the famous bloodless reconquest narrative.
Because de Vargas basically initiates a heavily armed standoff.
Right.
He sets up his artillery, points his cannons directly at the adobe walls, and cuts off the city's water supply. The exact same tactic the Pueblo warriors used on the Spanish 12 years earlier.
A taste of their own medicine.
Exactly. Then he demands total submission.
It's a terrifying game of chicken. Hours of intense negotiation follow. The Pueblo leaders finally agree to a truce on the condition that certain notoriously cruel Spanish settlers are never allowed to return.
Right, they had demands too.
So they open the gates, de Vargas marches in, gives a sweeping self-congratulatory speech in the plaza, and forces the friars to instantly baptize 122 Pueblo children born during the exile.
And then he fires off letters to the king claiming a divine, peaceful, bloodless victory.
So essentially, de Vargas pulled off a 17th century public relations spin.
A monumental PR spin.
Claiming a peaceful victory while hiding a brutal military crackdown that was about to happen.
Because it looked incredible on his resume. And for centuries, that PR spin was codified into history. Starting with a proclamation in 1712, the city celebrated this bloodless return, completely burying the horrific reality of what happened just a few months later.
Because de Vargas didn't stay. He went back to El Paso to gather the actual settlers. In 1693, he returns to Santa Fe to permanently occupy the city.
And this time, the Pueblo people realize the Spanish intend to fully reimpose their tyranny. They refuse to give up the capital.
The illusion of peace shatters. A brutal, bloody 2-day battle erupts in the freezing December weather. De Vargas uses his superior weaponry to storm the city walls.
And his retribution is merciless. Once he captures Santa Fe, he orders 70 Pueblo warriors to be executed.
Wow.
He takes their wives and children and distributes them as servant slaves to the Spanish colonists.
The absolute opposite of bloodless.
And the bloodshed didn't stop there. In 1696, realizing the Spanish meant to crush them again, another massive Pueblo revolt broke out.
How did de Vargas respond?
With a scorched earth winter campaign. He bred their corn, starved them out, and hunted them through the mountains, permanently fracturing several Pueblo communities who fled west to live with the Navajo and Hopi.
And de Vargas himself pays a heavy price. The politics of the colony turned toxic. A rival governor actually throws de Vargas under house arrest for 3 years for embezzlement and inciting revolts.
And on a personal level, it's heartbreaking. His first son from Spain, Juan Manuel, travels all the way across the ocean to Mexico to reunite with the father he hasn't seen in 27 years.
But de Vargas is trapped up in New Mexico.
Right, and Juan dies of illness before they can ever meet. De Vargas eventually catches a severe, fever-likely dysentery while hunting Apaches and dies in Bernalillo in 1704.
The Reconquest firmly reestablished Spanish rule, but the trauma of the 1680 revolt fundamentally altered the mechanics of that rule.
The Spanish learned a harsh lesson. They could no longer govern through pure, unyielding tyranny. If they pushed too hard, the Pueblos would unite and slaughter them again.
So they reached a tense compromise.
Exactly. This is when the concept of Pueblo Catholicism shifted from a secret rebellion to an acknowledged, pragmatic reality.
The Franciscan friars stopped smashing the kivas.
Yeah. They allowed a blending of Catholic rituals with indigenous traditions. It wasn't born out of sudden enlightenment. It was a survival mechanism for the Spanish as much as the Pueblos.
This tension settles into a very long, very isolating era for Santa Fe, stretching through the 1700s and into the 1800s. The city becomes the absolute forgotten edge of the map. They're completely cut off from the global economy.
Their entire lifeline was the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the royal road of the interior land. It was 1,500 miles of punishing desert between Santa Fe and Mexico City.
Supply caravans pulling heavy wooden carts only arrived every 3 or 4 years.
And if the caravan was delayed by weather or ambushed, the entire capital of Santa Fe literally starved.
The isolation was so profound that they had to adapt their entire way of living. They didn't have access to European iron, textiles, or stone.
This is the era that birthed the authentic Santa Fe style of architecture out of absolute necessity.
They couldn't build European structures, so they fully embraced indigenous adobe construction.
Right. They built thick earthen walls to insulate against the violent winter freezes and the baking summer heat. They enclosed courtyards to protect against wind and raids.
And speaking of raids, their economy shifted entirely. Because Madrid and Mexico City ignored them, they had to build complex, highly volatile trade networks with the surrounding nomadic nations, the Comanche, the Apache, the Ute.
The Spanish traded horses, iron knives, and unfortunately human captives in exchange for buffalo meat and hides.
It was a fragile ecosystem where today's trading partner could be tomorrow's raiding party.
But the earth shifts beneath them again in 1821. Mexico wins its independence from Spain.
Instantly, the strict, paranoid trade embargoes of the Spanish crown are dissolved. The borders burst wide open.
And that same year, an American entrepreneur named William Becknell blazes the Santa Fe Trail, an 800-mile dirt highway stretching from Missouri right into the Santa Fe Plaza.
The economic whiplash is staggering. Almost overnight, this starving, isolated adobe outpost transforms into a bustling international port of entry.
You have wagons full of American-manufactured goods. Calico cloth, hardware, glass pouring down the Santa Fe Trail, meeting the Mexican merchants, bringing silver and mules up the Chihuahua Trail.
The primary sources paint such a vivid picture of the Palace of the Governors in the 1830s. It wasn't a quiet museum. It was a chaotic customs house.
Yeah, you had international traders renting out rooms inside the ancient adobe walls to stockpile their hardware.
Outside on the dirt plaza, local bakers and fruit vendors are shouting, selling food to itinerant merchants. The volume of trade was so heavy that back in Missouri, the Mexican silver peso became the common daily currency.
But that influx of American wagons didn't just bring cloth and hardware. It brought the watchful eyes of the United States government. The Americans saw the wealth flowing through the territory, and they wanted it.
This triggers the American era in 1846.
Right. During the Mexican-American War, General Stephen W. Kearny marches the U.S. Army of the West right down the ruts of the Santa Fe Trail.
And he captures the capital of New Mexico without firing a single shot.
The Mexican governor realizes he is completely outgunned and flees south. Kearny marches into the plaza and raises the American flag over the Palace of the Governors.
But the true devastation of the American takeover wasn't military, it was legal.
When the Americans arrived, they brought the Kearny Code. This completely overhauled the civil and criminal justice system, and most importantly, it fundamentally destroyed the existing system of land ownership.
Wait, if the Kearny Code brought American law, How did that actually dispossess people who already owned the land under Mexican or Spanish law?
Yeah.
Didn't the treaty guarantee their property?
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to respect existing property, but the mechanism of American law made it nearly impossible in practice.
How so?
For centuries, under Spain and Mexico, land was often granted communally to entire villages or pueblos. The boundaries were defined by natural landmarks, from the large cottonwood tree to the crest of the ridge.
Right.
But American courts demanded precise, surveyed individual property deeds written in English.
Which these families obviously didn't have.
Exactly, and the burden of proof was placed entirely on the impoverished Spanish-speaking locals. Corrupt American lawyers and land speculators, known as the Santa Fe Ring, manipulated the courts.
It's so predatory.
They would offer to represent Hispanic families in land disputes, but demand payment in land. Through legal loopholes, taxation, and outright fraud, millions of acres of ancestral Hispanic and indigenous land were legally stolen and transferred to wealthy Anglo speculators.
It fundamentally shattered the social and economic hierarchy of the region.
It really did.
So, what does this all mean? In the span of a single human lifetime, a person living in Santa Fe went from being a neglected subject of the Spanish crown to a citizen of the Mexican Republic to an occupied subject of the American military, watching their ancestral lands get carved up by English-speaking lawyers, all without physically moving an inch.
And yet, the most radical reinvention of Santa Fe's identity was still to come, because the wagons of the Santa Fe Trail were eventually replaced by steam and iron.
In 1880, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway finally arrives in the territory. Ironically, the mountains around Santa Fe were too steep for the main rail line, so the train actually had to stop at a depot in Lamy, 18 miles away.
Yeah, and passengers took stagecoaches into the city. But the physical distance didn't matter. The railroad fundamentally changed the psychology of the city.
The trains brought a massive flood of Easterners, tourists, anthropologists, health seekers looking for dry air, and artists.
But these tourists were arriving with very specific, highly romanticized expectations. They had read dime novels, they wanted the mystical, ancient Wild West, they wanted cowboys and romanticized Indians.
Meanwhile, the local civic leaders in Santa Fe are panicking. The wagon trails are dead, the economy is slumping, and they realize that to survive, they need to capture these tourist dollars.
So they decide to give the Easterners exactly the fantasy they were looking for.
This initiates an era of aggressive, deliberate commodification of identity. Anglo outsiders and local business leaders actually passed city ordinances mandating what we now call Santa Fe style.
They legally required buildings in the historic districts to be built with brown stucco, adobe, flat roofs, and protruding wooden vigas.
It wasn't historical preservation. It was an architectural invention. They were retrofitting a city to look uniformly ancient.
My favorite detail in the sources involves the Palace of the Governors.
Oh, this is great.
In 1878, when American influence was peaking, the locals wanted to look modern and civilized, so they slapped a very trendy white Victorian portico with a fancy balustrade onto the front of this ancient mud palace.
It must have looked ridiculous.
It did. But by 1913, when the tourism boom hit, the city realized that Victorian architecture didn't sell postcards. So they ripped the Victorian portico off and built a rugged, heavy Spanish colonial-style portal to make the building look older, rougher, and more authentic for the tourists.
It was essentially set design.
Exactly.
And they applied that same set design logic to their actual history. In 1883, the city boosters organized something called the Tertio Millennial Exposition. They heavily advertised it to the East Coast as a massive celebration of Santa Fe's 333rd anniversary.
The only problem being that nothing historically significant happened in 1550.
The date was completely fabricated.
It's the 19th century equivalent of corporate astroturfing. They just made up a fake anniversary to sell train tickets and hotel rooms.
They devoted the first day of the festival to native culture, the second day to Spanish culture, and the third to Anglo culture, heavily promoting this shiny, marketable myth of tricultural harmony.
And that myth of tricultural harmony became the official brand of the city as New Mexico pushed towards statehood, finally becoming the 47th state in 1912.
The aesthetic branding worked flawlessly. Santa Fe attracted world-class painters and writers, sparking a massive cultural renaissance. It led to the creation of the Santa Fe Indian Market in 1922, which provided a crucial economic platform for native artists. But the sources demand that we view this critically. If the architecture was legally mandated to look exotic for Eastern tourists, and the festivals were literal historical fabrications, Is Santa Fe's famous aesthetic an authentic reflection of its past, or just a very successful early version of an architectural theme park?
It is a profound paradox. The aesthetic was based on genuine historic techniques, but forcing the entire city to conform to it was a commercial strategy. The city saved itself economically by freezing itself aesthetically into a romanticized version of a past that never actually existed.
And worse, that curated harmony sold to tourists actively masked the brutal, ongoing reality of poverty, systemic erasure, and marginalization experienced by the actual lived Pueblo and Hispano populations.
Which brings us to the modern era, where the tension between the curated myth and the lived reality finally boils over into the streets.
The 20th century brings massive external pressures. During World War II, the Manhattan Project sets up a secret checkpoint at 109 E Palace Avenue.
Suddenly, the ancient adobe capital is the gateway for scientists rushing up the mountain to Los Alamos to build the atomic bomb.
Then, starting in the 1960s, you get an influx of counterculture hippies, followed closely by high-end art galleries, luxury boutiques, and immense wealth. Santa Fe transforms into a cosmopolitan hub for the ultra-rich.
And the dark, mechanical underbelly of that wealth is severe gentrification. We have to understand the mechanics of how this gentrification works.
Walk us through it.
Wealthy outsiders arrive, captivated by the mandated Santa Fe style. They buy up modest, historic adobe homes in the working-class barrios to use as summer homes or luxury rentals. Property values and property taxes skyrocket overnight.
And the families get priced out.
Right. The ancestral Hispano and Pueblo families who have lived in those homes for generations can no longer afford the taxes. They are forced to sell and move out of the city entirely.
So the physical displacement of Native and Hispanic populations that started centuries ago with muskets and the Kearney Code continues today is just driven by real estate markets instead.
And as the local populations are pushed to the margins, a fierce battle erupts over the narrative of the city. Who gets to decide the story told in the public squares?
This modern friction is most visible in the debates over public monuments and celebrations. For decades, the absolute centerpiece of the Fiestas de Santa Fe was a pageant called La Entrada.
Right. It was a public reenactment of Diego de Vargas's quote-unquote bloodless return in 1692.
The official proclamations for the Entrada praised the Spanish for returning as humbler people and claimed neither culture was subjected.
Which, as we discussed deeply, is a historical fantasy that ignores the executions, slavery, and warfare of 1693 and 1696.
For years, Native activists and their allies protested the Entrada. They argued that dressing up and celebrating a man who enslaved and executed their ancestors was a grotesque celebration of genocide.
The protests grew incredibly tense, with lines of police separating protesters from revelers. Finally, acknowledging the profound pain it caused, the city and the Fiesta Council agreed to formally retire the Entrada pageant in 2018.
But the debate over public memory didn't end. During the global movements for racial justice in 2020, the historical tension exploded into physical action.
On Indigenous Peoples Day in 2020, activists tied ropes to the Soldiers' Monument obelisk in the center of the plaza and toppled it.
Earlier that same summer, anticipating unrest, the city preemptively brought in a crane to remove the bronze statue of Diego de Vargas from Cathedral Park.
Now, we need to pause here and be super clear. Our sources outline two completely divergent, deeply held truths regarding these 2020 monument controversies.
Right, and we are absolutely not endorsing either viewpoint here. We are just impartially reporting what the source material presents to understand how this history is actively contested.
Exactly. We aren't taking sides. So for many Native activists, organizations like the Pueblo Action Alliance and their allies, these monuments and the figures they represent are active symbols of brutal colonization, systemic erasure, and outright genocide.
From their perspective, leaving these statues in public spaces is an ongoing endorsement of that violence against Indigenous people. Toppling them is an act of dismantling colonial oppression.
But on the other side, for many Hispano residents and organizations like the Caballeros de Vargas, these statues and the fiestas are deeply personally meaningful.
They do not view de Vargas merely as a conqueror. They see him as a symbol of their own ancestors' survival, their Catholic faith, and their enduring presence in New Mexico despite centuries of hardship.
For them, removing these landmarks is perceived as a direct attack on their identity, an attempt to sanitize or erase their specific history from a city that is increasingly gentrified by wealthy Anglo outsiders.
The author Sarah Horton, referenced in our dramaturg notes, offers a fascinating framework for this. She suggests that for the Hispano community, participating in the fiestas is a form of cultural reconquest.
It is a way to publicly assert their historical ownership and presence in a downtown plaza where they can no longer afford to live or shop.
And there is this incredible, almost painfully ironic footnote to that idea of cultural reconquest.
The DNA testing.
Yes. For years, the Fiesta Council required participants playing the Spanish roles, like de Vargas or the Fiesta Queen, to provide proof of Spanish descent and have Spanish surnames. But with the rise of modern DNA testing, many of the people proudly playing the conquistadors discovered they actually carry significant Native American DNA.
It perfectly illustrates the profound complexity of New Mexico. The bloodlines are completely intertwined, even as the historical narratives violently clash.
And marginalized groups are continually finding modern platforms to assert their presence against historical erasure. You see it in how the Santa Fe Indian market has evolved from a tourist curiosity into a massive indigenous-led engine for artists to dictate the terms of their own representation.
You see it in local organizations fighting to reclaim the true history of the land grants.
We started with a city built on overlapping physical layers. Now, the battle isn't over physical territory, but over narrative territory. Who gets to write the plaque?
It is staggering when you step back and look at the massive timeline we've traversed today.
From the Tiwa people drawing water from Ogapuj to a freezing Spanish outpost desperately trading with Comanches for survival.
From a dusty Mexican trade hub flooded with American wagons to an occupied territory carved up by lawyers.
And finally, to this highly curated, fiercely contested, globally famous art capital. It's dizzying.
It is. And the most important takeaway from all these sources is that when you walk the streets of Santa Fe, you aren't just walking through a dead timeline of history, you are walking through competing living memories.
Every adobe building, every public monument, every empty pedestal, and every street name has multiple contradictory truths attached to it.
The history isn't settled, it is actively happening all around you.
Which brings me back to the very beginning. I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. Think about adobe itself. It is the defining, mandated material of Santa Fe. But adobe is essentially just mud and straw.
Very fragile.
Right. Left to the harsh elements of the high desert, it naturally washes away with the rain and crumbles in the wind. To survive, a real adobe wall requires constant patching. It requires relentless replastering and rebuilding by human hands. Could it be that Santa Fe's history operates exactly like its buildings? It isn't a solid, unchanging stone carved in the past that we can just point to and agree upon. It is a fragile, messy structure. And every single new generation that lives there has to continuously mold it, reshape it, tear parts of it down, and plaster over the cracks to reflect who they are and what they need the city to be today.
That's a beautiful way to look at it.
Thank you for taking this deep dive into the sources with us. Keep questioning the timeline, and we'll catch you next time.